welcome one and all to this event that we're super thrilled to have been able to organize. So this is the fourth iteration of the Ideas in Practice series that we've been organizing, and today's topic is kind of about creativity broadly construed in the context of mathematics and music as well. I'm Patrick. I'm a grad student in the philosophy department at the University of Toronto. Also moderating this discussion is Hannah Fernenberg. I'll pass things off to Hannah.
So hi, everyone. I'm Hannah. I'm a graduate student in the physics department at McGill University. And before we start today's discussion, we thought that we'd just give a brief description of what this discussion series even is for those of you for whom it's their first time here. So Patrick and I, along with two other peers from our undergraduate program, conceived of this idea a few years ago. And we realized that while philosophy is meant to provide the tools for conceptual analysis, which better help us understand the world around us, for many, it has become an obscure intellectual ivory tower, which has become completely inaccessible. And this has two downsides, of course. It prevents the public, as well as other academics and other disciplines, from engaging in philosophical issues, which limits the value of philosophy to the rest of society. And it also distances philosophical issues from their actual objects of study, thereby limiting the depth of its own work. So we decided to try and bridge this gap and help remedy this situation by bringing philosophers and, of course, non-philosopher practitioners together from a variety of disciplines together in one place to create a platform for the cross-pollination of these ideas. And in 2020, we launched Ideas in Practice, which is this discussion series that is supposed to achieve this goal. And we offer a chance for also the rest of our community, you guys in the audience, to ask questions to our panelists and become involved as well.
So today's discussion is something that at least we're all very excited about. We've got two really wonderful speakers who I'll introduce now. So it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome Bill Bruford and Günter Ziegler for this discussion. So Bill Bruford is a drummer, composer, musicologist, wears many hats. He's best known for his role as kind of one of the founding figures of progressive rock music with bands such as Yes, King Crimson, UK, many others, as well as his later work in jazz and jazz fusion with projects such as Bruford, Earthworks, again, many other bands. And he's really played an integral role in the development of new sounds that shaped the development of contemporary music. And then following his retirement from performance in 2009, Bruford obtained a PhD from the University of Surrey, focusing his research on creativity and musical performance. And then he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Yes in 2017. So we're very, very happy to have the opportunity to speak with Bill today. And then our other speaker is the distinguished Günter Ziegler, who is a professor of mathematics and also the president of the Free University of Berlin. His research, for which he was awarded the prestigious Leibniz Prize in 2001, focuses primarily on issues in discrete mathematics related to things like polytopes, topological combinatorics, and discrete geometry. And he's also the co-author with Martin Egner of the book known as Proofs from the Book, which is, of course, a renowned text that documents the most elegant known mathematical proofs in many different for many different mathematical theorems, following the vision of the late Paul Erdős. So another really wonderful panelist for us to be able to talk to about these issues today.
So today's discussion will proceed as follows. Each speaker will begin by providing a short introduction about their thoughts on today's topic, which will then proceed into our moderated discussion, which will enable us to dive deeper into these topics. And throughout this discussion, for all of you in the audience, please feel free to make comments either with the chat or ask questions with the Q&A box. At the end, however, we will have a 30-minute Q&A session where you, our audience, will be able to interact more with our speakers, either by asking questions with the Q&A box or by speaking to them directly using the raise hand button. So without further delay, I will ask our first panelist, Bill, to share his thoughts on creativity in music.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you for inviting me onto the panel, Patrick. And it's a pleasure to be here. What makes a good idea and how do we have more of them? How do constraints motivate thinking? What's the role of one's culture and environment in cultivating new ideas? These seem to be the questions in front of us, all good questions indeed. covering a huge area, which I can probably do little more than try to point to on the map. New ideas are generally the product of a creative process, I think. Creativity itself is a slippery notion. Everyone wants it, everyone wants to be it, but we're unsure quite what it is, what it's for, how to get it. Most understandings of creativity take it to mean acting in the world in a new and significant way to make something useful or valuable, perhaps. It's a process of connecting differing but viable ideas in unexpected ways. Good ideas, I think, provide solutions and answers to existing problems and questions and to those as yet unasked. Any idea has a greater or lesser potential to bear fruit. It may be useful and valuable, but then again, it might be irrelevant or inappropriate or impossible to enact. Ideas in the laboratory have probably little or no moral or ethical dimension. They're simply ideas until they're put to use, and that might be some distance, of course, from the original intention. The quality of the idea comes to light through its application. So genetic modification, perhaps, or splitting the atom, where I'm sure brilliant breakthroughs into new knowledge. But their subsequent applications were highly controversial. Ideas may pre-exist, but need to be uncovered or discovered or recovered and connected to something else, perhaps resituated into another domain in order to have some potency. Good ideas come from noticing and remembering, connecting that noticed to that remembered to rediscover something already overlooked or forgotten, perhaps, and connecting the result to things others have noticed and remembered, and so on ad infinitum. Chance favors the connected mind, as has been said. A good idea carries significance for many. I think the electric light bulb, penicillin, or those ideas aimed at solving the climate change conundrum. Significance is produced by the articulation of the idea within a common network of assumptions and meanings, such as you might find in medicine or mathematics or music or climatology. New ideas can only become significant by engaging with these ideas, with these networks, in order to change them. So the performance of a student drummer, for example, who can knock out a passable backbeat on a drum kit in his or her own bedroom, thus remains unique rather than creative, because while only he or she will do it in that specific way, that particular performance fails to engage with a larger network of meaning. Of course, all variation is in some way new, but not all is significant. And it's precisely creativity that begets the significant variation. It's creativity that transforms the trivially new or different into the significantly new or different. We can apply some of this thinking to music performance. Music provides both a space for creative action and a feeling of social connectedness through partial sharing of experience. But musicians, anecdotally, we don't sit around talking about being creative anymore, I suspect, than mathematicians do. And the notion of novelty is not particularly helpful in creative assessment either. If my drumming has not been derived or imitated or copied or translated from some existing drumming, i.e. it's entirely new, wouldn't be recognized as drumming. Anyway, novel for whom? The creator or the recipient of the creation? A better question perhaps is not, is it new, but does it matter? For creativity to be enacted, the individual or collective needs to select one course of action over another, choose something, differentiate it, communicate it, have it assessed for significance. So what counts in drum performance actually is not where you got the idea from, but where you take it to. In other words, how have you differentiated it? Does it matter? Playing drums upside down might be novel and different, but significant only for the fellow doing it. It's unlikely to change how most drummers do things. Far from the romantic paradigm of the lone genius in the garret, contemporary accounts suggest that creative ideas come from social interaction with others. If I wanted music innovation in short order and you said to me, Bill, get us some music, I'd select a small collective of intergenerational mixed gender musicians from diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds who don't know each other and who are preferably unfamiliar with each other's instrumental capabilities. I'd lock them in a room together with everything they need: food, drink, equipment, and a big box of donuts, and tell them they have to prepare 20 minutes of music for a global broadcast in a couple of days' time. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but only a little. A marginally more humane version of this has produced worthwhile work in my experience. That kind of environment is where half ideas are connected to and meet the other half, kind of like speed dating, or jettisoned or revisited. It's sometimes referred to as a liquid network. It'll be messy, fractured, malleable, surprising, and in flux, but it should be encouraging of interactivity. Think about the cramped spaces of the intimate coffee shops of 17th century London that played such a part in the rise of capitalism. So how do we get more good ideas? Well, create more liquid networks, I guess, and persuade people to inhabit the kind of environments from which creativity has been found to emerge. Drink more coffee with like-minded souls, do things with other people, collaborate collectively. Hat makers gather in a certain part of London, jewelers in a district of Antwerp, and IT specialists in Silicon Valley and Berlin. Musicians gather in the bar after the performance, of course, with critics, journalists, audience members to sift good ideas from bad, an activity that may well spawn more creative thinking than the performance just witnessed, of course. And what role does culture play in all this? Well, at the risk of gross oversimplification, we might say that culture is the sum totality of what a group of people think, how they behave, and what they produce that is passed on to future generations. Culture regulates action and defines its possibilities and conditions. It's very powerful in doing so. Culture shapes the mind and mind shapes culture. For example, the link between creativity and the drum culture is mediated by the corrosive influence of the culture's organizing ideology. Western music culture has a pitched instrument prejudice. Drummers are seen as culturally distinct by virtue of their engagement with a drum kit, an instrument of semi-definite pitch, and thus of what has been called a lower order. This long history of denigration of the instrument and its practitioners is deeply ingrained, and drummers are only now beginning to be rehabilitated and accorded the status I think they deserve. As Michael Cole reminds us, we fail like fish in water to see culture because it is the medium in which we exist. And lastly, what about other constraints upon creative action? Far from being restrictive, real or perceived obstacles and constraints are not merely conducive to creativity, they are a necessary aspect of the creative process in order for creative action to constitute experience. Constraints may be real or perceived, self-imposed internally, sometimes deliberately as creative strategies, or imposed externally by others, and they may have positive or negative outcomes. For the musician, maybe the mathematician, some of these will apply in mathematics too. The constraints may be agentive. How much control do I have? Temporal, how much time do I have? Musicians are always under pressure. Technical, do I have sufficient technique to do what I want, to play what it is I'm hearing? Style and genre, if I do this, it'll sound like gospel music. If I do that, it'll sound like death metal. Environmental, acoustics, humidity, background noise, equipment that falls over, these all play a big part in performance and need to be navigated around. Aesthetical considerations and ideological considerations, navigating culturally specific beliefs regarding inspiration and perhaps talent and authority and values. And freedom is not all it's cracked up to be, an observation to which many so-called free jazz musicians will attest. If you can play anything, i.e. without constraints, there is in some sense nothing to play. The creative mind of a musician or a mathematician probably will devise all sorts of imaginative ways to circumnavigate or co-opt these constraints. It's this sort of messy entanglement with them from which the performer experiences emotion and gains awareness, and from which emerges the full experience, which it is the work of art to communicate. I feel I should really stop there because I've laid out a fair amount of stuff and I've spoken too much already, so let me pass it over.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really awesome kind of exegesis of lots of different ideas all in one place. So very great to hear. If maybe Günter, if you have also sort of a short opening remarks that you would like to make on these kinds of questions.
Yes, with pleasure, though perhaps I would keep it shorter because a lot of things that Bill has been saying are actually applied to mathematics in a similar way, although of course there's differences. In her opening, Hannah described philosophy, or said philosophy is seen as a pure intellectual ivory tower, inaccessible to others. And I think that mathematics perhaps has the same outside view in some sense. And we mathematicians would from the inside claim that mathematics is something very beautiful, very interesting, something where someone can be creative. And of course, that again gets you down to the question of what does creativity mean? What does creativity mean in a field like mathematics? Mathematicians would claim that mathematics is an art. And I think it makes sense to think about that and perhaps also to talk about that for a while, because it's not obvious. It's also not obvious what is meant there. And the reason why that's not obvious is if people talk about mathematics, it's also not clear what they are talking about. I've sometimes said that there's 3 or 4 kinds of mathematics around. There's mathematics, sort of the toolbox that we need for everyday life and things that come from Stone Age and everybody needs to count. And that's sort of everyday life mathematics. But then there's also the mathematics which is part of a culture. It's that people have been developing ideas, have been creative in mathematics for 2,000-3,000 years. And so there's a very richness of ideas and creativity in there. And then there's mathematics that is important because it's the basis of high tech. There's mathematics that comes to life and which is interesting because it's useful and because it's needed. And even the computers we sit in front of us, they are mathematics machines, and so we are talking to mathematics machines about the question, what is mathematics and what you can do with it? And again, the question is what kind of creativity is in there. Now, I have a favorite cartoon by a Berlin cartoonist, which shows a man standing in the center of a room and saying to himself, I would love to do something creative, but I don't know what. And I always thought this is very funny, but it's if you want to be creative, I mean, what does it mean in mathematics to be creative? And again, that goes back to what really is mathematics and which of these mathematics or types of mathematics are we talking about? And if we talk about mathematics, I mean, the one part there is mathematics as a science rests on theorems and proofs. And Patrick has referred to this book that we wrote, Proofs from the Book, where the idea is that God has this book which has the perfect proofs in mathematics in there. And where Paul Erdős always told this story, said that as a mathematician, you have to believe in the book. You don't have to believe in God. And I think that's sort of a belief in beauty in mathematics, in the core of mathematics, in the way we do proofs. I'm a geometer, so I would see the beauty in geometric structures. But there's also the beauty of applications where you can do something and be creative about how you do things using mathematics, using ideas, having ideas about how to use ideas. So there's a lot of creativity in there. And with that, I hope I bypassed sort of the basic question about the philosophy of mathematics, which asks whether actually you can create mathematics. And there's sort of this Platonic view which says mathematics exists. It's the same for everybody, everywhere, which means you cannot create it. All you can do about it is to discover it. And I think the opposite view, one of many, of course, is basically the Aristoteles view, which says that mathematics gets created at the point where you apply it, and you build it in order to apply it. And I think both views are right, because they refer to other types of and other parts of mathematics. If I talk about myself, about what does it mean to create mathematics, why do you want to do it, then I come back to this thing that mathematics is an art. And these mathematicians claim that mathematics is beautiful. And if you ask mathematicians, then they always arrive by a quote by Bertrand Russell, the philosopher and writer and all that, which says that mathematics, rightly viewed, possesses not only truth, but supreme beauty. A beauty cold and austere, like that of a sculpture, without an appeal to any part of our weaker nature, without the gorgeous trappings of painting or music, yet sublimely pure and capable of a stern perfection that only the greatest art can show. So that's describing math as something cold and austere and beautiful. And I found a beautiful quote by a mathematician from Budapest, and a philosopher, who said, I hate that quote. And he said he hates it because mathematics is a human creation. It's warm and kind and flawed and repairable, just like art. So I don't know whether it's true about art, that it's flawed and repairable, but it's true about mathematics. And I see that in the little time I have to do mathematics, but also what I've been doing the last year is a lot of part is that is to, of course, making mistakes, because on the way to finding out anything, making mistakes is part of being creative, but also repairing mathematics mistakes is an important part of mathematics. And so with all of that, I think I like the quote by a guy called Istvan Lennart, who said, mathematics is a human creation, warm and kind and flawed and repairable. That also means it's accessible. If it's flawed and repairable, it also means it's human. And then we are in a very human endeavor and not in the perfect stuff in a book. So I hope that that gives you a little glimpse of where I see the need and the beauty and the joy of being creative with dealing with mathematical things.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So this is a really great place to be starting a conversation, I think, because we've now heard two very cogent and clear and interesting opening remarks from very different corners, but there's obviously lots of similarity and things like that. I guess to kind of a soft opening question to get the ball rolling for the more moderated discussion. And I promise this is not going to divulge into a biographical interview, but what compelled both of you to pursue careers in creative disciplines? What attracted to you to those fields as something that kind of you wanted to devote your life to? What was the appeal there?
So I'm not after you.
I thought I should not start with how I started to learn the piano, and that for a number of years I played the flute and unfortunately never got to the drums. As a kid, I was overly ambitious, and my way into mathematics was with mathematics competitions. And trying to prove to others that I could do it. And perhaps it's interesting because that's not the most creative access to mathematics, because there it's the only thing you can do is discover, and you get problems posed and try and answer them. And it's very rare that you find an original solution to a problem. But it was, for me, this was my ambition and my fun with doing it, and my fun with proving to everybody and proving to myself that I could do it, and that I could have fun with it, and this joy of being then successful and the joy of discovery. And I think the joy of creativity comes later, or came later to me.
I think in my case, I started with a pair of sticks or something when I was a young teenager, 12 or so. But eventually it becomes something that was impossible to refuse. I mean, I did my level best to not become a musician. I tried everything else. I went to universities. I did everything I possibly could do. But somehow, if you can't, they say, you know, if you can't sleep at night and you have to do it, then of course you've got to do it. But if you can sleep at night, I wouldn't consider it as any kind of a meaningful existence at all. It's a deadly sort of profession. But once you get started, one thing leads to another, and then your eyes begin to open. And for a long time, I think I very slowly gravitated towards ideas of creativity. Although I didn't have any doubt about any of this at all when I was a beginner. I just thought I was fantastic. And then slowly you realize, of course, that you're not fantastic, and slowly you look for more things in the music. And fascinating journey it's been. But it was one I didn't gravitate to immediately, and I don't have a musical background in my family. It's not as though I was being driven by parents to do something or another. I just sort of found my way into it, and flourished because it was circumstances under which it was almost impossible not to flourish in the 1960s and 70s.
Did you feel you were good at it? Was it important to you to be good at it?
It was very important to be good at it. A little like you, Günter. It was important to be good at it. And the only people who know whether you're good at it or not really are your colleagues and peer group, which is possibly the same with mathematicians, but the only person you're really going to trust in music is other musicians for their opinion. Everybody else is a kind of a bystander with more or less irons in the fire, skin in the game, as they say.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is, when you, at a certain point in people's career, when they're pursuing something like math or music, you hit a pivot point where you are no longer a student, but now you are kind of a member or a contributor to that field. So did you find it difficult to make the transition from student, where you're learning rules, you're practicing, you're dealing with what already exists, to having to either learn how to conduct research or write new compositions where you are breaking the rules and really tapping into the more creative side?
Well, good question. I don't think I saw it as anything quite as black and white as that. I should explain, Hannah, that I'm not a trained musician. I do not have the benefit of any kind of conservatory telling me how to hold a pair of drumsticks. They don't do that. You pick it up on the street, and immediately, from sort of day one, I was in a liquid network. I was with, these wonderful things. They can be wonderful things. Small mobile groups of people, 5 or 6 at the most, probably, all of whom are engaged in the same kind of conversation. And you join these and give to them what you can, and leave them when, as is your obligation, when you feel you can give no more and you've learned everything you can, you move to another one. And everybody has fresh ideas, and you're in a permanent state of, as I described, a liquid network where everything is up for grabs. So the sense in which I stopped becoming a student and became, as it were, a professor, it doesn't quite translate that way in my particular world. you do become an older citizen in some way, and generally speaking, you play better. No doubt about it. You play better over time.
It's definitely different for me because, of course, I did sort of the usual way into mathematics with, mathematics at school, and then I did study mathematics and physics at university, and then this was first in Munich and then at MIT, and that also means it's not the creative path in there. I mean, it was really learning things, understanding things, solving problems. And even then when I got into doing research papers and not anymore mathematics competitions, this was as a problem solver in some sense. And if I look at my early papers, it's solving problems. There's later papers then where it was much more exciting to me to discover structures, to describe geometry, and where I would in the end say, this is creative. But actually, if I also see the most recognition I got in the end, I think was not for solving problems, but then basically as a writer. And I did, the first university classes I was giving when I came to Berlin became a book called Lectures on Polytopes. And when I wrote this book, I was a world expert or was recognized as a world expert in polytopes suddenly. And then this thing called Proofs from the Book, which at the first glance isn't that original because we wrote up everybody's or other people's proofs. That's what in the end made me famous. I mean, it's an amazing bestseller in mathematics. I mean, this year is the 5th edition, sort of just from my...
Congratulations.
It was, but I mean, that was, and it was such a success because people said it was beautifully written. It was beautifully illustrated. Mathematicians, perhaps all mathematicians, research mathematicians, typically these days, they insist on typing their stuff themselves. They spend a lot of time in typography. It's not like you do it in Word and send it to a publisher, but we worried about typed it ourselves, looked at the formulas, illustrations, there's cartoons. How do you explain it? What's the page layout? All these things, and there's a lot of aesthetics in producing mathematics. And of course, this book is special, but even in nowadays research papers, they're all written in a program called LaTeX, developed by a mathematician and computer scientist in Stanford. And that's what we mathematicians use, and the aesthetics of how you write things and the typography, it's part of the game, and the images and all of that. And somehow it got more creative in the way of what you produce.
And where do you meet with your fellow colleagues? Do you meet at the university bar and swap ideas in a liquid network? Because it sounds like the first part of your career was very much on your own. You sound, whereas mine was never on my own. I would have died to have been on my own for more than 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think I was in that sense on my own until I got my PhD at age 24, where then I had a wonderful advisor who came from Stockholm and taught me lots of things, and there was things in dialogue with him. And I realized that after that, when I came to Berlin, it became more and more networks, people to talk to, people. There's these mathematicians have their secret meeting places, which is not a stadium, but there's a place called Oberwolfach, which is a little research institute in the Black Forest in Southwest Germany, where there's a mathematics conference every week and on a specific topic. And Oberwolfach has a huge lecture hall and two smaller lecture halls. and a bar with beer and wine, and there's a billiard table that's important, and there's a huge library that's important, and it's a setting for talking to people and to discuss things. And then, I mean, mathematics happens at the blackboard. There's very many blackboards where you talk to people, explain ideas, or you find your paper and the notepads and discuss. And I discovered only later that it's a very, that the creation comes from communication. I still have a style where I would talk to people, we would discuss problems, develop ideas, and then I feel I have to work it out. And working out and writing up is something I would do alone. I mean, I can't write while someone's watching or so, that doesn't work. But that's sort of the post-processing. That's sort of the, in the end, the recording studio when all the creativity has, or most of it has already happened.
So I wanted to interject here and ask kind of something about the informality of this kind of creative process that's being described, because on the one hand, we do see in both cases, you know, there's the standard of the published journal article in mathematics, the stadium concert in music, and all of these kinds of things. But there's all these different degrees, and it seems that each degree that you step away from a formal context, you end up having looser, less rigorous conversations that seem to be more valuable, right? Like the value of an academic conference is not the 20-minute talk, but the 20-minute coffee break between the talks, and the value of the concert is not the show, but the conversations at the bar after the show, and so on. So it seems like there's this interesting dichotomy on the one hand between wanting to present your creative product in a way that is kind of packaged and precise and exactly the way that you want the audience to experience it, be that a musical audience or a readership of mathematical literature. But then how you get there really depends sensitively on being willing to throw away all of the standards that you start out with. So I guess the question here is, how can we make a balance between the sort of rigorous standards that we aim for in the end and the necessary throwing away of those standards in order to get there?
One observation is, I mean, we're talking about creative processes, right? And creative process has lots of different parts. And I think not a single one of these parts will work if you take it as an isolated thing. And I mean, perhaps I should stick with mathematics, but there's sort of ideas in notebooks which are completely wrong. There is conversations with friends and colleagues about things that might work. There's discoveries in the library. There is concentrating and solving problems. There's working outs and typing. There is lectures at the blackboard where you try and do sort of the rough version, perhaps also make mistakes. There's people from the audience who interrupt you with an idea. There's in the end a written paper which may or may not have mistakes in it. And in the end, even in mathematics, for many people, including me, the real thing is not the recording or what we call the published paper, but is the live show. It's presenting it at this huge 6-part blackboard in Oberwolfach.
Wow!
And I have celebrated that in a few cases where there was this amazing workshop at UCLA where I had a result to present, and to present the result was not the paper that was written later, but it was really doing this at the blackboard. And doing it at the blackboard I mean, as mathematicians, we have much more perfect ways of presenting things, and I can, you know, typeset whatever. Chalk, blackboard is in some sense still the real thing, where you feel whether the ideas arrive or they don't.
That's very interesting, I think. Fascinating that you point to this performance aspect of the blackboard with the chalk. And I can see this. I can imagine, you describe it very effectively. I can imagine this performance aspect because that's what I do. And one of the difficulties with performance is that it's not really subject to revision. I think there are the more sort of plastic and static arts that you can revise. You know, you're a novelist or you're a sculptor, you can have another go at it. Generally speaking, a performer doesn't have another go. You get it and you get an instant result, which many musicians really like. They like that a lot, that people either show you very quickly whether you get a result or not, whether you've connected in some way. And sometimes people say you've changed their lives even, which is an extraordinary thing to say, but they do say that sort of thing. And I think they mean it. And this business of being subject to revision is quite interesting, and of course is very prevalent in dancing and theatre and improvised comedy and things like that. It's not subject to revision at all. You're on and you perform, and that is the moment at which you communicate and significance is attributed or not. You don't have to wait to publish a book. I have done an academic book, and it took, you know, over 3 years, I was able to revise it a lot and to tweak it and make it all nice and lovely. The risk for the performer is that it might go all wrong, and it can do. And you may have noticed that, you may have felt that at the blackboard. You may have felt, I'm not getting my point across. I'm not communicating this effectively, perhaps. And effective communication, the communication of your experience, the expression of your experience is the communication of the work of art. That's the work of an artist, really. So you made that connection earlier on, Günter, between mathematics and art, and it's in there somewhere. Fascinating.
Of course, it never happened to me that I was at a blackboard and felt I didn't get my ideas across.
Oh, okay.
I don't know whether you've ever been on stage and had the idea, it's a bad evening, I don't get my thing across. Probably happens. I mean, if you try and be always perfect, then yes, you'll never be really good.
Yes, and I think that's part of my pleasure in the informal, what they call popular music culture, rather than the classical music culture. And it's noted that, you know, among classical musicians, by far the most creative part of their work is in the rehearsal room, outside of the public gaze, where the first interpretation of the music is found, and she decides she wants to play it a certain way like this, you're going to play that figure like that. And then it is produced on the concert stage as a matter of, is they're practiced that way and produced as a matter of a product being churned out in the different cities. Whereas on the whole, the more adventurous jazz and rock musicians won't want that level of perfection. They avoid that level of perfection. They wish things to happen on stage. It's very intercommunicative. When I say something with my instrument, I'd like it if you changed what you were doing to accommodate what I've just said. It's entirely conversational. And you know, people like me address people in business. For example, the last time I did that was a group of bankers, and you just play a 12-bar blues with a jazz group, and you let them see that what you're doing now is a direct result of what the person's just played over there, and that's then changed it, and it's been reharmonized, and the melodies come back again, but now it's in a different meter because I changed the meter. But that's, you see what I mean? It's an internal and a kind of organism that's forever changing, sort of like an amoeba that's ever changing. And they are astonished by those sort of audiences tend to be astonished by the flexibility, the communicative level, non-verbal, between people who seem to know somehow from this close relationship with others of what's going to come next and how best to make it sound, how best to make it work. So that's collective work.
Yeah, but that also means that there's sort of a contrast between creativity and perfection. I think there's parts of classical music where the ambition is to give a rendition, I don't know, Arturo Benedetti, Michelangelo. It had to be all perfect. And in the end, the question is it really as good as the recording? And that's not the things where things happen. Whereas this type of, I don't know, jazz music where something happens and it will be different every evening, that's where the creativity is on stage and not in the rehearsal room.
That's what we feel. And I run a long way away from the word perfection, which makes me very nervous.
I mean, mathematics has this special thing that, of course, it has to be correct. And there is a certain, there's certain standards of perfection that are needed. And again, if you then talk about performances, or let's call them teaching, then I think for the students, it's important to also watch the professor get things wrong, to discover the mistakes, try and repair it, sort of this, or then also at lectures try and, you know, there is an idea, try and work it out and fail. And in terms of teaching, you can learn more from failures than from perfection.
Yeah, fascinating.
So there seems to be kind of an interesting separation that's coming out of this, that from what Günter just mentioned, where you, on the one hand, have kind of the level of trying to create a new concept or a new idea from scratch, and on the other hand, given that one already exists and you want to share that with somebody, how best to share it? And then there seems to be two different levels of questioning kind of what this kind of activity of creation involves, because there's that first step, how do I find the idea in the first place? And then once it's there, how do I share it? And so then there's a question of, if your goal is to share an existing idea in a way that can communicate effectively, is the kind of subtle uniqueness of the individual articulation of that idea, for instance, you know, a particular teacher's derivation on a blackboard or a particular musician's performance of a piece, the subtle differences between those things will play out for the audience, but is there an obligation for one to try to be expressive in the presentation of an idea, or are there times when you should try to be as kind of faithful to the original as possible?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and creativity is really a very new idea, and pop music, or popular music, being quite conservative, there are plenty of areas of popular music in which creativity is not required at all. Get going on any creativity, you will be fired, you will lose a job. And much of music is about earning a living. So the vast majority are not like me, being able to sit around with you guys talking about creativity. We don't do that. We're too busy trying to scratch a living together. So I've forgotten where I was going with that. Günter, jump in. Was there something you'd like to say on this?
I was just, the way Patrick brought it, it sounded sort of like there's a clear division between sort of the creative process and ideas and whatever, and then the performance or the writing up and all that. And I think it's not that simple, and it's interesting if it's not that simple, because of course there is a creativity and there's a lot of work that goes into how to present things, and if mathematical ideas, I know it's this process of when you think about how to present things, you change things, and if you're lucky, you make them better. And
very good.
and
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
I think I referred to sort of messy entanglements with constraints. There is so much going on for a performer of any nature, and you suggested that you know, a university lecturer can be a performer indeed, but certainly live performance of dance, theatre, and music, and so forth. There's so much going on that it's beyond your control, and hence the idea of perfection makes it fine, because the idea has very little meaning when you can't control the circumstances. Really, you produce yourself, you produce your experience, and somebody turns the light on and says, communicate your experience to me. And that's more or less what we do. And I don't nail it to the ground any more than that, or try to control it to that, because during the process, I'm learning about myself. And the more I learn about myself, the possibility I have of changing myself. So music is for me a sort of mirror that you can hold up, you see what an idiot you are and what an idiot you have been, and what a mistake that was, and you're never going to do that again. And so you develop, you feel, you develop. Why we humans should feel we need this desire, why we have this desire to develop, I don't know. That's another lecture, another discussion, I think.
I wanted to follow up on some ideas that were mentioned during this last answer, which was the idea of simplicity. So in both math and music, simplicity obviously plays an important role. And for example, sometimes you encounter compositions where it's, you know, someone might learn something in a theory class, and then they throw all of their music theory at a single composition, and they're, you know, introducing wild time signature changes and very dissonant harmonies and key changes for the sake of key changes, and sometimes over theorizing one's composition doesn't necessarily buy you a great result. And Bill, you mentioned in your introduction that novelty is not necessarily creativity. And mathematics too strives for simplicity, because the business of proof shortening is obviously an important one in mathematics, because it can often provide new insights to a problem. So I was wondering, why can sometimes simple songs touch us more easily than complex ones? And why do simple proofs leave us more satisfied than long ones or convoluted ones? And sort of what role does simplicity play in creativity and in elegance in both music and mathematics?
After you, Günter.
Yeah.
Well,
I think for all these things, there's never only one criterion, and I think simplicity is an important thing in mathematics, and we would often say that a proof is beautiful because it's so simple, which may mean you finally understood it, or which might mean that it's well explained. But there's also things that are beautiful because they are so complicated, and where you're proud because you got it all together. And I think there's many different dimensions that in the end capture aesthetic qualities, but also capture things of the creative process. And I think simplicity is one thing, but it's just one of those things.
I think I would only add that I think one must ask simple for who, complex for whom, and that bear in mind that the simple and the complex can coexist. Certainly in music, you know, there's often a rather dull rhythmic backdrop, but a charmingly fluid and complicated idea on top, or vice versa. So complexity is a funny thing, isn't it? I mean, there's that extraordinary moment when you're learning a musical instrument, or when you're learning to ride a bike, the moment when you can't do it. And then suddenly, a nanosecond later, there is a moment when you can do it. And what was simple, what was complex is now simple. And this happens also with the physical dexterity of that a musician must, with hands, wrists, fingers, and all that has to be taken care of, which is difficult. And somehow at that point, presumably some synapses kind of go, and there's a connection is made in the brain, I guess, and suddenly what was simplex. So this is simplicity and complexity of execution of an idea, I guess. But I suppose, Hannah, you're referring really to the end product, aren't you? How you judge it to be simple and how you judge it to be complex. That, of course, would be different from Patrick, which would be different from me and would be different from Günter. So we musicians, on the whole, we don't even care about that. Because I can't, if I try to judge for you what I think you're going to like, on the whole, we're both going to fall off our bikes. It's better I do what you're paying me to do, which is be creative and come up with new ideas, and then you can dislike those.
I mean, in mathematics, of course, simple or complicated is also in relation to what you know. And
indeed,
as things, it's because, I mean, it's theory and things build on each other. And if a mathematician says to another, here's this really simple, beautiful idea, then you might want to follow up and might realize that this is sort of a diamond on top of a very high tower. And to get there and to appreciate the blue and the beauty and to understand that it's simple, or what is meant by this is simple, this may be a very, very long story. And of course, that also has to do with the question of how accessible are things and for whom. And
indeed,
it may be that most parts of music are more accessible there and don't have this, where you don't have to be on concern, have to study it in order to appreciate there's something beautiful there or there's something perfect there.
Yeah, there was what I think is a wonderful question by one of the audience members with regard to this. That says, isn't there a subtle difference between simple and easy? And for example, I could imagine while thinking about this question that perhaps you could have a very simple proof that was very hard to come by, or a very simple tune that, you had to, work for several days to get it to sound the way you wanted it. So is there a difference? Do you feel there's a difference between simple and easy?
Oh, definitely. I mean, easy it's a question of accessibility, right? Whereas simple sounds absolute, and that's already a difference. But I mean, in mathematics, simple has an aesthetic quality, but there's also this amazingly simple proof. And already saying this is a lot of appreciation, and may also tell you that you've come a long way, and that it was so hard to find this, ingenious idea, or this really new path, or this how to explain something. And so, simple might mean really hard to come by.
I think for a performer, or easy on the whole means ease of execution. Most performers would, if you said the word easy, is that easy? They mean, is that easy to do? So it's an ease of execution, I would imagine. But certainly in lots of musicians, you sense that they start with the complex, but now I'm taking long scale, over 40 years, they start with the complex and strip back whatever it is that Bill Bruford does. He keeps whittling away at it like you do with a knife and a piece of wood, and you keep trying to get closer to the diamond, to scrape away the accretion of the muck around it, to whatever it is you think is the Bill Bruford bit about you, or the Miles Davis bit about you, who got his trumpet playing down to just pretty much one sound and a beautiful way of playing. But having emerged from the busy world of 20 years earlier of bebop and all the complexities of that, which is very complex, So there is definitely in the artistic way, a way of stripping down to the essence of your experience. And that's partly what you're doing as you trundle on through life.
I have a follow-up for this. So this kind of relates to you talk about how the artist kind of refines, sort of hones in on what they are and what they want their voice to be, and develops that over time. But of course, they're also consuming more and more of whatever. So the musician's listening to more music, they're playing more music, they're exploring more territory. The mathematician is, reading new literature, having conversations with more people, and there's this broadening of the options that come available to them. And so then there comes a point where you kind of need to impose constraints in order to determine what you want to do next. And it seems that there's something subtly different between math and music with how that can go. So in music, it seems like it's possible to fairly artificially just decide, okay, I'm not going to let myself do any of these things. I heard a great story about the production of Peter Gabriel's Salisbury Hill, where the percussionist was only allowed a telephone book and a shaker or something like that. And you can artificially introduce these constraints. But in mathematics, it's not so clear how you could artificially introduce a constraint, because you're kind of like, it seems more of an all or nothing kind of project of deriving new mathematical results. So maybe there's some perspective on that kind of dichotomy about how we introduce constraints.
But I mean, there's lots of constraints in mathematics, and also in teaching mathematics, and in discovering mathematics. And like there's an industry in the type of combinatorial mathematics I've been doing, where people always look for combinatorial proofs. And the combinatorial proof is one that would not be allowed to use higher calculus and things like that. And I mean, this goes back to around 1900, when they discovered the prime number theorem, which says that the number of primes with, 20 digits is roughly what it is. And the original proofs, there were two proofs given in the same year by two mathematicians. One of them was Adama, and both proofs use this technology of complex functions and whatnot. And there was a real search for a combinatorial proof. And this was achieved 30 years later by Paul Erdős and others. And so and I think that, mathematicians would disagree, but I think this is very good questions. And that it might be valuable to look for a certain type of proofs where you're allowed to use this type of tools and not the others. Because if you do that, you understand more about what it is. Perhaps it's the same thing like if you're allowed to only a certain type of instruments to, as you said, with Salisbury Hill. And in the end, you discover more about the music if you're not allowed to play it on the instrument it was originally done.
Sure.
And
I ran a band for quite a long time, and one of the essential things we did at a sound check, before the audience comes in, is you test the instruments for the sound and so forth. But everybody plays a different instrument. You all play the instrument that is not yours, specifically to feel the physicality and embody the experience of what it's like to play a bass from that part of the room. Quite different to where the drummer is, or where the trumpet player is, or wherever. And it's a lovely way to see life from another person's point of view, and to bring that back into the ensemble.
So I have a question that is slightly in a different direction, but how do you see technology playing a role in creativity? Because now there are certain computer algorithms that can prove theorems. There are sound engineers who produce artificial sounds that would never be found in nature. So how do you use technology while still preserving kind of that human element that we were talking about earlier? Or does it take away in any way?
It might. I think it's always a question of how you use the technology. And in discovering mathematics, I mean, there is these tools around. And so in some sense, you're stupid if you don't use them. But if you rely on them too much, then on the one hand, you don't, it's not creative anymore. If you just let the machine do the work, but in the end, you won't understand whether it's really true or valid. And the goal will be to use whatever you have in technology, but do something valuable, original, or creative, or whatever using that. And if you can do without, then do without, which means I think it's important to make your own decisions about what tools you want to use and what tools you don't. And probably that's true in all fields.
Yeah, particularly true in music too. I mean, I'm sufficiently ancient that I have not managed to have a meaningful relationship with a laptop on stage. I get nervous if I go to a quartet recital and it's 4 laptops. I'm so old-fashioned that for me, part of the environment of a concert is seeing people struggle and seeing them struggle collectively. A collective struggle. This is what I want to see. This is what I want to hear. Anybody who's played an upright bass against a happening jazz drummer will realize that the physicality of this is beyond belief. Musical instruments have all kinds of political connotations too. I mean, if I'm going to a concert with a violinist and a lovely Steinway piano and perhaps a viola player or something, or a string quartet, I mean, already I know the kind of music and I'm in, and I get, my ears are adjusting to what kind of sound that's going to make, as distinct from, you know, the political connotations of a heavy metal group or a death metal thing or something. And again, the political connotations of having 4 laptops on stage, which leave me slightly nervous. And I don't know why. It's just that I'm just too old a beast to change. So I need to see people doing something in real time that involves. Of course, there is technology on stage. Lots. I mean, the technology of a Steinway piano is huge. But I know what you mean. You mean digital technology, I guess, probably. And there have been throughout my life, you know, early mixings with tape machines on stage, doing things, and tape feedback and tape loops, and early arrivals of that sort of thing on stage. And interesting it all was too. It's all interesting and fascinating. But many drummers have hybrid drum kits these days too, part acoustic, part digital, and they blend them beautifully, and they give you a huge range of sound sources, of course. But I leave that to the young. Good luck.
But in the end, probably one could do something creative and interesting with 4 laptops, but you will not expect 4 laptops to do something creative. And in the end, the question is how you use it, and whether you use the technology or whether the technology does things for you or tells you what to do. And I think that's something we don't want in the end, not only because it's not creative, but it won't.
Oh yes, that was very prevalent in the recording studios of London in the 1980s, with the advent of the computer into the recording studio, the computer being able to measure everything and see everything in oscilloscopic prurience, a kind of snooping, so that you would play 3 bars on the drums and you'd be stopped. And somebody say, well, that note there is, you know, 2 milliseconds ahead of that one there. And to a scientist, that was incorrect. Perhaps to a mathematician, that would be incorrect. To the musician, it's incorrect, but he would say, but I like it that way. I don't like perfection. I'm trying hard to be imperfect. Leave me alone. And these conversations got quite heated. So I've survived through most of that, but So what is perfect and what should be left as expression is a big topic in art, I think.
Mhm.
So there was a remark that was brought up in the chat, making the point that new technology, in addition to allowing for new possibilities for the sorts of sounds one can create, it also makes things more accessible to people in the sense that even if you can't afford a Steinway, but you might be able to reproduce a sound like a Steinway on your laptop. And it seems like there's now kind of this prevalence of there's more people creating because there's more accessibility to these kinds of tools, and also there's more interconnectivity where people can start to share what they've created. And so now you see this sort of what used to be a very much a sort of strict partitioning into disciplinary boundaries, at least in music, and I think even to a degree in math as well, you see that those boundaries start to fade because now there's just simply more people that are exploring the overlap, and so maybe there's something to be said about that. I don't know, kind of a vague remark, but maybe there's something to chew on there.
No, there's lots of interesting things in there. Lots of interesting things. I mean, even the nomenclature about musicians. Even when I speak of musicians, I sense a kind of ancient attachment to that particular word. And really, I should be talking about content creators, as they might do in Korea. Or I could be talking about music inventors, which is increasingly a term that is applied to composer, producer, singer, songwriter, and instrumentalists, music inventors. And almost everybody potters over from the recording device to this instrument to input a little bit here and or download a bit there and add this to that and sample a bit here. So I think that's interesting. And the world I grew up in and have worked in is rapidly diminishing and sort of disappearing over the horizon. As you say, everybody can make a CD in their bedroom, as it were, to use a metaphor. Of course, the difficulty there is that everybody makes a CD in their bedroom. And then we're in all kinds of problems because who's going to select which CD we should all hear. And finding a pair of ears to listen to what it is that you as a musician feel you have created requires another whole level of creativity, every bit as complicated as the making of the mere music artifact in the first place. So bringing it to market, as it were, or finding a pair of ears, as we might say, is extremely difficult. So, and lots of creative thinking goes on in that world too.
And from the opposite perspective, and one thing is that, of course, things got much more accessible in the sense that, you know, instruments, access to school, music school, mathematics school, the technological possibilities. There's so much more accessibility, which then leads to these effects that everybody can make a CD in their bedroom. But there's also all these new and enhanced possibilities of collaboration, of cooperation. It got such more, much easier, also with, I mean, the type of digital world we got into the last 2 years. So there's all these possibilities for exchange that are possibilities. And in the end, if used well, they make things possible that previously weren't. And if not used well, they just flood the world with things that no one wants to hear. And I mean, we tend to forget how fast things changed and how short the lifespan is, where we had all these communication devices and things of exchange. And I know 40 years ago when I was in the US for the Math Olympiad, I would have needed, I think, $4.25 in coins in order to call back to my parents in Munich. And I didn't do it. And it's so much about communication, right?
Yeah.
And for collaboration to get people together. I mean, in the pandemic, you've seen people do music over Zoom, and it wasn't all quite perfect, and you see also the technological problems. And I remember this choir recording of amazing choir here in Berlin, which was on Facebook, where you see this is the first time where you see them and they are not quite in sync. So that's also the technology is there and people try things, but
Yeah.
And all these possibilities for exchange are there, and that's also possibilities, of course, for new type of creativity, but you have to use it right.
So I think I'll ask one more question, and then after that, I think it'll make sense to transition towards questions from the audience and to get a kind of active Q&A going. And so what I wanted to ask is, there's been a lot of talk here about kind of the content of creative expression and the product of creative expression bearing fruit in kind of an aesthetic way, and that there's kind of an important sense in which beauty plays a role, and elegance and things like that, and also that there's communicative power somehow. And so I was wondering if maybe you could summarize, I guess, what your personal views are on what the values are of creative output. Like, presumably it's not strictly aesthetic, right? There's more to creative output than just that something looks nice. So maybe you could say a few words about kind of what the other values are that underpin why creative output is valuable.
I mean, we do mathematics for many different reasons, because it's beautiful, because it's useful, because it drives technology, because all of that. And I think for all of these reasons, in order to produce something, you have to be creative, and for anything to be interesting, it needs creation in the beginning. And I think the sort of the aesthetic output is only one part of the story.
I think for me, and I mentioned it earlier, really, my own personal, my personal involvement here is I'd like to know more about myself. So I could maybe do that by being a high diver or a scuba diver or something. It's quite possible, or a soldier or something. But for me, the culture in which I exist and the fish, the water in which he swims, my environment, I want to undergo this creative process to make meaning for myself, so I understand myself better, make sense of life, if you like, which is what I think a lot of people do, to try to make sense of things. Sometimes, you hear the most harrowing stories of young people, children perhaps, who've been traumatized in some way, and the policewoman looking after the young child will ask the child to literally express its experience in a drawing or with a doll, to talk to a doll. And this is an artistic, I suppose you could say this is an artistic, that is the work of art there, that the child is expressing. She or he doesn't know what's going on, presumably, but it's a very effective way of keeping you psychologically in a good place. And so I make music for my health, said he happily, which I do. I make music for my psychic health, I think. There are so many aspects to this, the creative process, that it's almost too many to bear. So I I have to shut out some of the noise and say, well, I'm here for this reason, and I'll work at that. And I'll probably meet somebody in the bass player in the next band I play with will probably be there for an entirely different reason, laughingly, because he thinks he wants to make a lot of money, which is the first reason all musicians think they're going to do anything.
Well, this is a really great way to wrap up, I guess, our moderated part of the discussion. I think that there have been a lot of really cool and insightful things that have been said. So let's shift now to the audience's questions. So anybody who's listening, if you have a question, there's kind of, I guess, 3 options. You can put it in the chat and we can see it, or you can use the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and then we'll have a queue. And so we can let you actually talk and turn on your microphone with the speakers and so on. So if you have questions that you want to ask, please feel free to send them out through one of those channels now. I'm just going to note that I see that in the Q&A there's a question that's related to more kind of biographical things about Bill's career in Yes and King Crimson. I'm not going to ask that question just on the grounds that there's already been a lot written about that stuff for various biographers and so on. But if you have any other questions kind of about this topic of creativity and so on, please feel free to send them along now. So the first one that I see here from a while ago in the Q&A is from Benoit, who says, talking about creativity in math and music, and since Western music also has mathematics at its core, rhythm, scales, etc., do you think it's possible to be creative in both mathematics and music? For example, can creativity in music create creativity in mathematics or vice versa?
Perhaps if I start, I mean, one observation is that there's many mathematicians who are also very distinguished musicians, and that also means also the other way around. And I think there's something gained always from connecting or being able to express oneself in completely different fields. On the other hand, people also tend to generalize that, and then it becomes wrong. And there's also many mathematicians who do not have musical talent, and where that thing just won't work. And everything I hear is that Einstein was a really third-rate violinist, and which may or may not be true, but perhaps it also doesn't really matter. Right, and so in any way, I think the connection isn't really as direct as people would think sometimes. That your mathematical talent already qualifies you to play the drums, and that's not true. And but it may ring the same chords in some sense for some people and not for others.
Yes, I would agree totally with Günter there, that I also have met many musicians, particularly keyboard players for some reason, pianists and so forth, very good with mathematics and enjoy that area. But I would think it's a long way from generalizing that. That's not transferable, I think, yeah.
Great. So I saw at one point also there was a hand raised by Dan Hudson. Do you still have a question, Dan? Maybe if you can say something in the chat. Yeah, okay, great. So what I'll do then is I'll press the allowed to talk button, and now you should be able to join us, I think.
Hello?
Yep, hi.
Okay.
Hello, Dan.
Hi. It was kind of a while ago, but I think at one point Günter was talking about how it wasn't until he finished his PhD that he finally felt as though he could become a little bit more creative and I guess take part in the discussion of mathematics, where as a musician, you were almost immediately born into being able to, talk about music. I mean, everyone starts a band when they're just learning an instrument that sucks, but you're able to play covers and whatever. Do you think that that's more of a consequence of sort of like the intrinsic complexity of math as opposed to music? I mean, like I'm a PhD student in math and I'm also a musician. And just from my perspective, it's just a lot more difficult to get to the point in math that you can talk about it freely with people than it was with music, to just be able to, play Smoke on the Water with your friends.
I think it's all very true. Also, the question is who you can really then talk freely to about mathematics. This may be your fellow graduate students who also have the background and the understanding to do exactly that. But my point would be that first, I mean, we have to admit that mathematics is difficult. And mathematics is difficult for, you know, kids in elementary school, and mathematics is difficult for research mathematicians. We're talking about different types and parts of mathematics, but it's still there. It's something you can be desperate about, or something you can be proud of, but real research mathematics, I mean, builds on so many layers, and that means it takes time to get into, and to learn the language, and to learn the tools, and to do something really creative in advanced parts of mathematics. Just takes a lot of time and takes a lot of preparation and all that. On the other hand, the talking about part is interesting, because it's not only communicating your results, but it's also that mathematics has developed over the last few decades, perhaps, into a much more communication type subject. And that's not only my own biographical thing that I was quoting, that I said, you know, I've been collaborating with people and working with students and all that after I got my PhD and moved to Berlin. But it's also, if you look at the statistics, then 40 years ago, basically all papers in mathematics had only one author, or at best two. And now there's so many research papers by groups of 4 and 5, where in mathematics also usually you do not say who discovered what, but it's joint work, and it may come from conversations, or it may come from discussing a project and dividing who does what, but that's a communication and a collaboration subject, and it didn't used to be that way, and I think that's a very good change.
It's a liquid network.
Mm-hmm.
Which is excellent. I think, in complete contrast really to Günter, I think one of the great attractions, one of the few great attractions of popular music, is its immediate generosity. The whole point of popular music is it only comprises 3 chords and a backbeat, or 3 chords and beers and a couple of beers, or 3 chords, beers and girls, depending on whatever whatever your frame of reference is. And immediately it's fun to do. It's very simple, which is why it's popular music. It's music that people can join in. From there, it can get very exciting, of course, and far, far more complicated. But it has partly to do with rules. And I think Benoit was asking a little bit about rules, and is mathematics subject to many more rules than music, or the other way around? It's not the quantity of rules that I think is of interest, it's the attitude to the rules, and musicians are actively encouraged to break them. Certainly in my field of music, you know, here's the rule, how can we get around this? So this is creative entanglement with constraints, which we've been a sort of subtext through the afternoon so far, or perhaps morning. I'm not sure who's in an afternoon or morning, but this haggling and negotiating with constraints is the fun of being a musician, and that's great. And I'm not sure quite how far in Günter's world breaking rules is a good thing, or easily done. More difficult, perhaps.
Breaking rules usually isn't a good idea in mathematics. Breaking styles, finding new approaches, wherever you create it. In some sense, you break standards, or
Yeah, sure.
So I see we've got another hand raised from Tim Hallett. So Tim, would you like to speak, I guess? Okay, I'll see if I can give you the permissions there. So Tim, you should be able to join us now.
Great, thanks. So I have kind of 2 closely related questions to each other. I'm curious about the role of improvisation in both of your respective creative processes. So to what extent has your creative process been influenced by improv during a performance? So during a music performance or a big show, to what extent do you, are you a largely compositional performer, or do you improv, and what extent has that changed the way that you're thinking about a certain problem that you're doing right now, or a certain piece of music that you're performing, or something that you're working on? It's more obvious to see how this relates to music, but I think in math, you also mentioned live performance being relevant. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. Thanks.
Well, in my world, I've gravitated to improvisation as much as humanly possible. I love that. Literally dealing with the unforeseen, really. I mean, everything about a performance is unforeseen. And now I'm talking about even environmental considerations. You know, you don't know the venue, you don't know the instruments, you're probably a rental instrument of some sort. Everything about a performance is unforeseen. And I like that, and I'm confident enough as a musician to ensure that you, the listener, won't really be able to detect the difference between music that has been labored over for months in a rehearsal room and music that has been improvised in the second right there and then. My job is to obscure the join. The art is to conceal the art. You don't need to know that. But I'm getting a huge amount out of the evening. I mean, I sincerely hope you do too. But I'm getting lots out because I've never been quite in that position before, when something radical has happened on stage and I've been left alone, or the other way around. And it's through that I come to know myself, come to know my experience, begin to express my experience, and have some fuel for my work of art, or my art, as it were. So I'm a big fan of improvisation. I love it. And I have no idea how that works in mathematics.
I mean, mathematics, I think improvisation doesn't apply to writing mathematics. If I present mathematics in, if it's a conference talk or a seminar or a regular lecture, and there's always a certain amount of improvisation. At least it's not typical in mathematics to sort of write out the blackboards for what you want to do. And the tendency in recent years to do PowerPoint or PDF or whatever, I think it makes things worse in mathematics. I mean, there's this traditional teaching, which is good. And part of it is it's always the interaction with the audience, and the interaction with the audience changes what you do. And sometimes the most valuable part of a lecture is then the Q&A in the end. And the experience in mathematics and conference lectures or whatever is that often doesn't happen, or isn't good, or isn't valuable. And there's sort of, people ask 3 questions, so 3 questions are asked. But on good nights, you get into really good conversations with people in the audience. You get ideas, there's matches, there is, someone knows a paper that others have known, and there's suddenly a connection of things. And then it becomes really valuable. And in some sense, you go to the stage and do the seminar lecture in the hope that in the end, you'll get a few valuable comments or ideas, or if not that, then the other way around, that you do the seminar to inspire others. And if it's only that you say, and in the end, there's this one problem I haven't solved, and I would be particularly interested, and someone grabs it and perhaps comes back after a year with an idea, then it's worked.
Perfect.
Thank you, Tim, so much for your question. You said you had to, do you have another one, or were they bundled?
They were sort of bundled.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Tim. So we have now 2 other questions from the Q&A in the chat. So the first one is reads, in facing conservatism, be it in popular music or well-established math, in your experience, how can one promote a new creative idea when one faces risk of being fired, or not being published, or not having their music played on a radio station? And should music and research community seek to be more creative, or I guess more welcoming to new ideas?
So,
Or is
in
there maybe a benefit to having a bit of safety or a bit of constraint on what gets out and what doesn't?
Musicians need to know, and that you learn the hard way, where creativity is welcome and where it's not. And you may have more or less agency in moving along a kind of continuum between, at one end, kind of well-known conservatives type of approach, which must be conducted for this music session that you're in. This must go this way, this toothpaste general. But at the other end of the continuum, you might be, in a highly compositional sense, able to play what you want. And somewhere between the two, you're going to be more or less creative, quite probably. The trick is knowing which you're in. And through this network of musicians, this pool of people you're with, you'll become known for the kind of music you prefer to play, kind of music you never want to play. And you can just about skirt around it like that while still avoiding being fired by anybody. But this is very sophisticated kind of social navigations that are going on here, I think. And a musician needs to be well equipped, I think, with interactional and social skills to survive for more than 5 minutes, really, with others in this pool of musicians.
I mean, in mathematics, I think, creativity is welcome, and I don't see a problem at that end. I more or less see the problem on the other end, where if you don't start with this image of cold and austere and perfect and round and whatever, but where you realize that mathematics is full of mistakes. And the part that I've been battling with is what happens if you see some other people's work and you realize there's mistakes in there, and perhaps the people don't want to admit that, and the creative part needed from you is really to rework that and to point out that it's wrong and to try and repair it and that sort of thing. And that's perhaps not what we call creativity, but it's also the part that's not really welcome, and where you might have to fight, and that's more where the fights are, but they are connected to this more realistic image of what the science is and what happens there, and it's not this this process of someone has a brilliant idea and writes it up and then it's true for the next 5,000 years, but it shows that the whole subject is a creative thing and is a community thing, and there's things that may be true but no one understands, and there's these things which may be true, no one understands, and no one admits that they don't understand it. There's the parts where the guy who wrote it says everybody else who doesn't understand it is stupid. And I mean, I can give you examples of very prominent parts of mathematics, like this Japanese mathematician who claims he can prove the ABC conjecture, and who says that everybody who can't understand that is stupid, including some Fields medalists. And there you find that this is a very lively subject, and that it's also a very human subject, because it's not in the end about publishing in perfect typography, but it's about a community establishing what's true and what's not true. And then I realized that in different parts of mathematics, this is completely different stories. Maybe the same in music, where in some parts of mathematics, people are so awfully helpful that it's just wonderful. And you have these colleagues who you've never met, but they send you amazingly helpful comments back on your manuscripts. And I've been working in algebraic topology, and it's just beautiful, and in discrete geometry. And then there's other parts of mathematics where no one dares to say that this famous paper is wrong, and where everybody only fights about attributions and it's mine, and don't write anything
yeah.
without quoting my 7 important papers there. And then there's hostile parts of mathematics, where definitely then creativity isn't welcome and doing something different isn't welcome.
That's fascinating, and just flashed up on my screen there for 2 seconds was a message, I think, from somebody called Miles, possibly, reminding us of the old Thelonious Monk line that there's no such thing as a wrong note. There's just some notes that are more right than others, something like that, which is very true in jazz improvisation, which starts with the idea that you are working in a supportive community. So in a serious sense, there is no such thing as a wrong note. It's just the context in which that note is heard. So in other words, if I play a wrong note, it's your fault, guys, because you haven't put it in the right context, which is one way of looking at that. But it is, as you mentioned, Günter, some of your mathematician friends are immediately supportive, and same in jazz. You know, the people will tell you anything you want to know immediately and be helpful as they possibly can. At least the very good musicians are, because they are the secure ones. The less good, the second best guys, are perhaps not quite so friendly. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, this comment was in the chat. That's the last one.
I was in the chat.
Miles Avictor, it's there, but you read it right.
So there was another question from Miles, I think directed more towards you, Günter, that it says, I'm curious as to whether creative burnout is felt similarly by mathematicians as it is by musicians, and how that plays into the process of attempting to create, and how, do you have any tips for avoiding burnout or overcoming burnout?
Well, first, to find an expert for this question, you would have to find someone who's experienced this type of burnout, both in mathematics and in music. And that hopefully is difficult to find.
Not so difficult. We have one in our panel here.
Yes, Dan perhaps has some insight in this. Is that who you're referring to, as someone who has experienced?
No, I was referring to myself. I stopped playing 12 years ago. I haven't performed for 12 years because I just didn't want to do it anymore. And the reason I to and fro trying to look for the psychology of this is partly what got me into the psychology of music creativity and so forth. And what happened effectively was that I couldn't hear what came next. I don't mean that in a facetious sense, that of course I know what the next bar of the music is, but my whole life I'd heard in my ears what I wanted to do next. And I knew what to do on Monday week, where I could go with a drum kit in my own head, what I could get it to do, a good place for me to put some effort, how to push the thing forward. And I knew for a good 40 years what to do, but eventually I wasn't hearing that in my own ears. And that met also a perfect storm of the impossibility of running physical groups with the amount of income. So that's one of the constraints. How are you making enough money to pay for the music you want to play, which is very important, and was touched on, I think, by somebody who was talking about not having enough money to make the thing work. And so I thought best for me to get off the drum stool and let somebody else have a go, which is really the best thing. So I'm not critically injured in all of this, but it would have been called a burnout, whereby you simply don't enjoy the milieu you're in anymore. You feel you've probably done enough, and you're happy enough with that, and that's okay. So I'm perfectly happy with that.
Of course, a serious burnout in the sense of depression and all that is
Yes.
Is still a different story, hopefully. And I know that happens in math, and that happens in music, and and there's all kinds of degrees, and that it's difficult to be creative over decades, and and that if you're really creative and really gifted and really doing things, then it's always a walk on the edge, and there's always the question of can you maintain that? And we know that the best people, perhaps in all fields, are the ones that are not filled with self-confidence, with up to their ears, but being insecure, I think, is a prerequisite for really being creative, at least at times. And if you don't question yourself, then where do you go? And if you seriously question yourself, where do you go?
Exactly.
Exactly. You know, and this question about confidence, and I can do it, and I can perform, and I can be creative, and I can create things is one thing, and this, you know, have I learned enough? Do I know enough? Isn't there other people who can do it better? Do I have the right partners? Do I have the right tools? All of this is good questions, and perhaps struggling with that is part of the creative process in the end.
All right, so we've got a couple minutes left, and it looks like there's one more question. There's a hand raised from Daniel Luo. So Daniel, I'll give you a chance to unmute and ask your question.
Okay. All right. So hi Günter and Bill. So speaking of improvisation, like, do you usually go with gut feeling during the process? Like, are you trying to, like, when you improvise, do you mostly figure out the direction where you want to go, and then sometimes your gut feeling tells you that you're not going in the right place, and then you start to deviate? And also, do you happen to experiment more in the studio or on stage when it comes to improvisation?
Well, it's a slightly musical answer to all this. Improvisation. Well, the instrument I play is enormously powerful thing, drum set, which has the power to shape the piece of music that you're playing. So, good idea to have a form as the tune is progressing. You have a form and you have a clear end in mind, and how you'd be able to direct and color this. And often I play with a pianist or a keyboard player alone, and so there's no harmonic clash, of course. And the instrument is, as I say, powerful and can change the tenor of the music very quickly at the drop of a hat. And you're aware of that all the time as you go from something that's breathy light to something that's extremely heavy, for example. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that. And listening to it's somehow two parts of your brain. You're listening to where the music's taking you and taking the music and influencing that as you hear it. It's an extraordinary thing, and I can't describe it in the 1.5 minutes left any more accurately than that. It's a difficult game, but you learn with it experience, I think, quite a lot. And I've forgotten what the second part of your question was quite, but I think that covers most of it, doesn't it?
I guess so. I guess so. I was also asking, like, whether it's more in the studio or on the stage where you play around more. Yeah.
Well, these days, most of the recordings I've made in the last 20 years or so have been live recordings. Okay. For all kinds of good reasons. They're a whole lot cheaper, they're a whole lot better, they're a whole lot more authentic, but I hate to use that word. They tend to be what they are. And I kind of like that rather than the studio manicured version of things. But thanks for your question, Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much.
Perhaps from my side, I can tell you the story of the first paper I wrote, which was as a graduate student at MIT, and I was struggling all Saturday from morning at 7 until the afternoon and trying to prove a certain thing. It was a problem my advisor had suggested, and I had a tape recorder. I was running Simon and Garfunkel, the Central Park concert, and turning that over again and again. At some point that wasn't needed anymore and didn't happen anymore. And then at some point in the afternoon, when I really couldn't do it, I stopped and thought perhaps it's just plain wrong. And the creative process was, in the end, really to turn around 180 degrees and keep that flexibility and to do exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. And then it was very quick. I mean, half an hour later, I had a counterexample in my notes, and then I wrote that up and slipped a piece of paper under the office door of my advisor. So I drove into to MIT to really document that.
That's great.
But so in that sense, this was not the stage. This was really me at home alone. First with Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, and then really alone, and not these million people in Central Park. But sort of the part of being creative also meant, you know, you'll have to take turns at some point, and that's what I did.
Yep.
Well, that seems like a really wonderful place to, I guess, to leave off for the sake of this conversation, because I know that we've kind of gone a little bit over the intended time, and you know, both of our speakers have lots of other things that they have on their plates. So maybe we'll call it here, and I'll just say thank you to everyone who showed up to this to listen, and of course, very much huge thanks to both of our wonderful speakers, Bill Bruford and Günter Ziegler, for sharing their very valuable time with us and having this really interesting conversation with us. So thank you both very much.
Thanks a lot for setting this up.
Thank you, Patrick. Well done. Bye-bye, Günter. See you. Hope you.
I will.